In the debate about Christian apologetic methodology, two views have received constant attention. They are evidentialism and presuppositionalism. These are not the only views on offer, but these two have stirred up the greatest amount of controversy, mostly due to the fact that these views are thought of as totally at odds with one another. But is this the case? In this video, we shall examine both these views and find out exactly what their differences and similarities are. Let us begin with an explanation of what evidentialism is, since it is the more popular and widely understood view. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines evidentialism as a thesis about epistemic justification, which states that person S is justified in believing proposition P at time t if and only if S's evidence for P at t supports believing P. Classical evidentialist John M. DePoe defines the thesis this way. Evidentialism, boiled down to its basics, is the position that affirms that beliefs require sufficient evidence in order to be justified. End quote. In essence, then, evidentialism is fundamentally an epistemological thesis. How, then, can we characterize presuppositionalism? In many cases, presuppositionalism has been misunderstood and mischaracterized due to the fact that it has been conceived of as the rejection of evidentialism. You would often hear that presuppositionalism eschews the presentation of evidence and presuppositionalism is fideistic. But nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is that presuppositionalist agrees with the thesis of evidentialism as currently stated. It is inaccurate then to characterize presuppositionalism as the antithesis of evidentialism. So what then is presuppositionalism? What exactly is the major point of disagreement between the presuppositionalist and the evidentialist? Well, it is important to distinguish between presuppositionalism, which is an epistemological thesis, and presuppositional apologetics, which is an approach to defending the Christian faith. The two are related though, and we'll get to that in a second. But first, let's explain what presuppositionalism is. Presuppositionalism as an epistemological thesis has one major gripe with evidentialism. I mentioned earlier that the presuppositionalist does not necessarily disagree with the thesis of evidentialism. Of course, the presuppositionalist agrees that a subject's beliefs must be based on evidence in order to be justified. There's no disagreement between the presuppositionalist and the evidentialist there. The presuppositionalist, however, thinks that the evidentialist is too naive in his conception of evidence. To see this, let's take a look at how an evidentialist defines evidence. John DePoe writes, and I quote, "Evidence consists of a person's awareness of good reasons or grounds that imply that the propositional content of the belief is true or likely to be true." End quote. Once again, the presuppositionalist is in agreement with the evidentialist here. This looks like a reasonable definition of evidence. However, what the presuppositionalist would point out is that all evidence is theory-laden. In other words, all evidence is subject to the influence of theory. For instance, in DePoe's definition of evidence, we can ask what constitutes good reason. One's answer to this important question would depend on one's theoretical commitments. What this implies is that what counts as evidence is dependent on one's theoretical commitments. DePoe himself makes a similar point when he writes, "It is important to notice that this technical definition of evidence is different from the colloquial and loose ways of talking about evidence. Sometimes people talk about evidence as though it is nothing more than a physical object. Unfortunately, this loose way of talking about evidence conceals a number of significant features of evidence. For instance, a prosecutor might argue in a courtroom that the defendant's fingerprints on the murder weapon are evidence of the defendant's guilt, but the physical object alone does not point to the defendant's guilt. After all, one needs to be aware that fingerprints are unique to each person and that the probability of the defendant's innocence dramatically diminishes in light of the fingerprints' presence on the murder weapon. End quote. The poem makes the point that facts themselves are mute. They say nothing. A fact only becomes evidence when placed in a certain context, theory, or system. A fingerprint on a murder weapon is a mute fact. It only becomes evidence of guilt when paired with the theoretical commitment to the uniqueness of fingerprints, for example. Consider two people, a Christian and an atheist, who want to know whether or not humans have a soul. For the Christian, the fact of the Bible's affirmation that humans have a soul is a good reason to believe that humans have a soul. For the Christian, the Bible's affirmation is evidence. However, it is not evidence to the atheist. For the atheist, the Bible's affirmation is not a good reason to believe anything. What this shows is that whether or not a fact counts as evidence is dependent on the theoretical commitments of the subject. Evidence is theory-laden. This is what the presuppositionalist wants to point out to the evidentialist. The major disagreement between the presuppositionalist and the evidentialist isn't about whether or not evidence is required for epistemic justification. Rather, it's about the relationship between theory and evidence. The naive evidentialist conceives of evidence as independent of theoretical commitment. Presuppositionalism, then, can be more accurately described as nuanced evidentialism. What are some of the implications of this nuanced take on evidentialism? Here are a few. 1. It implies that disagreements about theory cannot be settled by appeals to facts or evidence. This is due to the fact that both parties will adopt different standards of evidence. 2. It seems to imply that arbitrariness is inescapable. If justification is dependent on evidence and theory precedes evidence, then it seems that our theoretical commitments are necessarily unjustified. 3. It seems to imply relativism, since there is no way to settle disputes over theoretical commitments. What is the relationship between presuppositionalism and presuppositional apologetics then? Simply speaking, presuppositional apologetics is the application of presuppositionalism to the question of apologetic methodology and religious epistemology. If all evidence is theory-laden, then what exactly counts as evidence for God would be dependent on the theoretical commitments of the subjects who are investigating the question. Naive evidentialists assume that the disagreement between the theist and atheist can be settled by the presentation of evidence. But the presuppositionalist, who has a nuanced view of evidence, acknowledges that the disagreement between the theist and atheist is concerning their theoretical commitments, and that the theist and atheist have differing standards of evidence. Presuppositional apologetics would have the same implications as presuppositionalism, but in the context of religious epistemology, these implications are problematic. Apologetics is meant to be a rational defense of the faith, but the presuppositionalist seems forced to accept that the disagreement between the theist and atheist cannot be rationally resolved. If the disagreement between the theist and atheist is fundamentally theoretical and arbitrariness is impossible, then what does the presuppositionalist have to offer in terms of a rational case for Christian belief? Are the theist and atheist at an impasse? Are they relegated to just clinging to their theoretical commitments arbitrarily? How can fideism be avoided? How does presuppositional apologetics avoid the problematic implications of nuanced evidentialism? Fortunately, appealing to facts is not the only way to settle theoretical disputes. What the presuppositionalist proposes is an internal examination of the individual theories on offer. The only way to critique a worldview without begging the question against it is to critique it on its own terms. The Christian theory can be rationally defended by illustrating that the alternative to it is internally inconsistent, arbitrary, and cannot avoid performative inconsistencies. As such, fideism and irrationalism can be avoided, and presuppositionalism can be seen as the most viable approach to defending the faith.